It's the Pareto Principle.
My buddy Vilfredo.
My guy, Joey Juran.
80-20.
64-4.
A little bit of that factor sparsity.
All that and a good deal more after the break.
Welcome back, all you beautiful people. We're talking the Pareto Principle. As always, I'm Nick. That's Eric. We're the Get Good Guys.
And this is the Get Good Guys. Ladies and gentlemen, it's January 24th, Wednesday, our usual release time, and we're so happy to have you. Thanks for being here. We are talking Pareto Principle? Pareto? Depends on where you're from and how you speak it, but it all...
Like most things.
Like most things, I think it's a matter of perspective.
Indeed.
We're talking about our guy, Vilfredo Pareto.
Vilfredo. I like that pronunciation.
I think we're going to go with that. Yeah.
Pareto.
If you get an opportunity to make a name rhyme, I feel like you owe it to
reasonable
the species.
Yeah, we'll let his parents know. Wasn't the first person to observe this, I'm sure.
Probably
but
not.
The first person, or the maybe most famous person attributed with this observation of the 80-20 rule.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. He was an economist in the very sort of early stages of that profession.
Yeah,
1906-ish, I think, is when
like
he wrote
late
this.
1800s, early 1900s.
Mm-hmm. And he was an Italian. He was a socialist. And he was making an observation about wealth and wealth possession and land possession,
distribution,
in Italy. But interestingly enough, not popular in his time. Right, it was popularized some 3.5-4 decades later by our guy Joey, by Joseph Juran, Juran, who in 41, in the early 40s, World War II era, was an engineer and was trying to decrease defects in manufacturing, and kind of stumbled across or came across this work by Vilfredo Pareto some years earlier, the so-called what is oftentimes now referred to as the 80-20 rule.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. I wonder if his lack of popularity stemmed from his kind of where he was finding this information.
Sure.
Right, in that time period in Italy, and he's saying he's from the socialist standpoint, and he's saying, hey, look, we have all of our most of our wealth and land is owned by this small chunk of people, and I'm curious if that had anything to do with it. But interestingly, we found out he was the one to coin the term elite.
Yeah, created the term
for like the upper level of society, which is interesting.
Yeah, to realize that word is as young as it is.
Yeah, I would have expected much older. For
sure. So that's two things that he created. The Pareto Principle, obviously, and then the word elite. Pretty interesting.
Well
and the history of Italy is a long one, and it's one of extraordinary wealth concentration. Right, you had the families of Italy that were effectively governments unto themselves, the de Medicis and so on, so that they had almost entire sort of city states.
Yeah.
So it's not unexpected that there would be this wealth concentration in a nation like Italy in a time like 1906.
Sure.
However, interestingly enough, as we've talked about in the past, the 80-20 rule, the Pareto Principle, these are observable phenomena that you can see in a lot of different places. Yeah. In fact, even today, wealth distribution remains the 80-20 globally.
Yeah, and we were talking about this earlier. Would assume that it's been that way since the beginning of time.
Right. That it could be that this sort of observable phenomenon just is when it comes to humanity. Yeah, that to clarify that 80% of the wealth of the globe is possessed by 20% of the population, and that holds true even today.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting. Moving kind of forward on our timeline, to our guy Joey
Juran. Juran. Yeah,
solid.
It's
really,
good.
really
it's
solid.
a good bit. I don't have a punchline.
Well, the problem is we can't quite put our finger on a lot of Duran
music. Yeah.
So that's a part of the issue.
Yeah. Get in the comments. Give us a few examples. Go ahead and
do.
You know what I want to see? I want to see 5 to 50 puns based on Duran songs about Joey Juran.
Would you say that like closer to 5 would be more correct for the 80-20 rule?
I think probably that's true, right? You're going to have 5 good ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then 40 bad ones.
But let's talk about where we can observe this a little bit.
Yep.
This in nature, if you will. We talked about Juran and his kind of development manufacturing. That is a huge place where it exists. And we talk about Six Sigma. We were talking about today.
Yeah, the Six Sigma principle, the idea of eliminating defect in a manufacturing process to the point where, and I don't have this right, but I think it is 1 in 1 million units. So the Six Sigma approach is out of 1 million manufactured units, only one will be defective. But to reach that sort of incredibly lofty height, you would apply this principle, because the observation was that Juran sort of stumbled on was that 80% of the defects that are coming out of a manufacturing process can be tracked to 20% of the problems. And then interestingly enough, Microsoft use this as a stated principle in their debugging programming. So when they would produce a product, and then they would have obviously like a quality control team that was working on getting rid of the bugs, they found out that 80% of the errors that software would throw could be tracked back to exactly 20% of the code.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and that's cool, right? Like the manufacturing, where it's something you quantify.
Yeah.
I mean, the wealth is something you could quantify too, but this is like actual numbers and data that you can just look at it on a piece of paper, right? It's pretty interesting. And the interesting part for us is that it seems to hold true for effort on a grand scale or an individual scale. Right. And I think that's where we find ourselves speaking about it a lot for the individual.
Yeah. Definitely. There's a couple other places. Risk management is a big one. OSHA uses this, the Occupational Safety organization, the agency in the United States that covers sort of workplace safety. Chases the 20%, like doggedly to try to eliminate 80% of the risk. And then you see this also observable in group human dynamics, where you'll have, if you have 100 people in the room trying to achieve a task, oftentimes it will be 20 people who are outputting 80% of the effort or 80% of the outcome.
Sure. Yeah.
Even if they are all working equally.
Right.
They're all putting in 40-hour weeks. It's 20% that are finding the way to contribute.
Well, and I'm sure most people have experienced this, right? Been part of some sort of group project where either they felt like I'm coasting a little bit, or they felt like they were doing all the work. Right. Depending where you might fall on the scale at the time.
Yeah. Well, and there is a human bias called the self-serving bias, which also sort of we attribute the good things that happen, we attribute to our own individual efforts, and the bad things that befall us, we sort of attribute to bad luck or like a bad break. And so that can make, sometimes in a group, it can make that dynamic tough to observe. If you're in it.
You're correct. From your viewpoint.
Yeah. Now we talked about 64-4. That's 80-20. That's like something you hear even if you've never heard of Pareto. We came across 64-4, I think, kind of for the first time in preparation for this episode. At least I did.
No, definitely for me.
And so this is very simple, right? This is just the Pareto Principle applied twice over.
Yeah.
So if I say, okay, the 80-20 rule, I'm going to look for those 20% inputs, those 20% of factors. Right? Yeah. If I do that again and say, okay, well, what's 20% of 20%? Well, it's 4. It's 4%. Right. Well, what's 80% of 80%? It's 64. And so there's kind of a movement out there that says, look, sometimes you don't have time for 20%. Sometimes you don't have the bandwidth or the resources for 20%.
Yeah, or don't want to put 20% towards that thing.
Or don't need 80%.
Right.
You just need 64%. And we were joking, it's a D- on a scale, which is like, that does get credit in most courses. And so you sort of go like, I just need to put my name on this test and walk out. Right. I need to not get a 0. So it is kind of an interesting sort of tidbit.
Well, yeah, and I wonder, how far that would go down. Hey, listen, let's do.
Yeah. Is there a 0.8? Definitely.
But yeah, it's interesting to explore, and we explore this, all the time in the guide. Right, about using our time and resources effectively towards that 20%.
Right.
In order to gain that 80.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting, right? The Pareto Principle is not a mathematical axiom. It's not as though, this is a truth of the universe. Conversely, it is observed, right? It is in the same way that the theory of gravity is still a theory, because you could try to disprove it, right? You could try to change it. The 80-20 rule of the Pareto Principle is based on observation of data in multiple areas. And so, our claim is pretty robust in the guide. We sort of say like, hey, look, this works.
This
right?
is it.
This
right?
is
Yeah.
this is what you do. You know, that was not necessarily Pareto's claim or even Juran's claim.
Yeah.
But that kind of takes us to the last point, which is this idea of factor sparsity, which is it's not just do 20% and you'll get 80%. Right? That's not the message of the guide. It's not the message of the Pareto Principle. It's not the observations of the Pareto Principle. But rather, it's about factor selection, which is really all the guide is about. It's figuring out those factors.
Right. Well, and I think that's one of the issues with thinking of the 80-20 rule as I would assume a lot of people think about the 80-20 rule.
Right.
As I'm just going to do 20%.
Right.
But that feels you're not going to get the 80% benefits from doing less, like just less work.
Right. It's not. You can't just randomly pick the 20%. Right. It's got to be the correct factors that put it in.
And Juran said he was getting a lot of his inspiration for a lot of his stuff from this Japanese Kaizen option, which is the same thing, right? They are identifying what the most important factors are, and then from that, choosing what to adjust. Right,
and then once you do have the factors selected, and you can test that hypothesis, now you go after those factors. Right, now with 100% of your effort, you're applying your effort to those factors. And so you. If ever, you're in the guide and you're going, man, these guys really like talking about goal setting. They really like clarifying goals. They really like, paring down and paring away the non-essential. Well, yeah, because it is based on factor sparsity. It is seeking to help the user find those 20% factors and then.
Yeah, well, and maybe we'll talk a little bit in the Patreon because we're running short on time here about a little bit more of this factor sparsity, and we were even talking about. Someone we know who's working on the guide and finding some ways to narrow their goal or specify their goal a little bit more so that it's more achievable.
Right, absolutely. All right, my friends, well, thank you so much, and we will see you in the outro. Well, gee, thanks, everybody. We sure do appreciate you taking the time. This has been the Pareto Principle here on the Get Good Guide podcast. If you'd like a little bit more, by all means, we invite you over to the Patreon. That's patreon.com/getgoodguide. You can check out the companion episode for this and every other podcast episode that we do here on the Get Good Guide. If you want to head on over to getgood.guide, there at the center of the Get Good galaxy, you can find, of course, the downloadable guide full color, grayscale if you want to print it and not waste quite as much color ink, or even a fill-inable PDF, thanks to our friends over at Fiverr. And if you want to check out those Fiverr vendors, we use them on occasion when we need someone else to be good. We have affiliate links down in the description, so thanks so much for supporting the podcast and the galaxy. As always, I'm Eric. That's Nick. We're the Get Good Guys.
And this is the Get Good Guide.
Let's get some levels. The Pareto has a principle.
I once knew a man. His name was Pareto.